All right, let's get the side of Nebraska things. Mike Schaefer covers the Cornhuskers for Husker 24/7, and he's the best beard in the Big Ten. What's up, Mike?
I appreciate that. That's a big compliment. You know, there's a lot of competition out there in this conference. A lot of people have great beards, so to earn that, I feel like it's probably the biggest win that Nebraska's achieved in the
Uh,
last few years.
there you
I
go.
really do think so.
For those wanting a big beard, I can never go this long. Like this is as long as I've had it in a while, Mike. Which usually I'm like the lowest setting or whatever. I can't get past a certain point. So what is the key to growing a big beard for everybody out there?
Laziness. I mean, it all just stems out of being unwilling to shave and putting up with the early stage itchiness.
Yeah.
And then after that, you just start to realize that your face somehow looks better with hair growing out of it than when there's not. I mean, I last was clean shaven for the Kentucky Derby basically in 2017. And
Wow.
I look at those photos of which I've often compared to the guy in Jurassic Park because I have like the whole get up on. I look at those photos and I think I made a terrible, terrible decision, and I can't replicate that again. So 5+ years since I haven't allowed the sunlight to directly hit my skin right around my mouth.
That works. It works for you, Mike. So
Thank
good
you.
job with that. All right, Mike. As someone who has covered so many coaching searches, I don't know if I can empathize with you with how long this thing is going to go.
It's horrible.
Yeah. So
It
what is this
is. It
coaching
really
search
is.
like in like week 4 or 5, and probably 5, 6 weeks here to go.
Yeah, I this is the third Nebraska football coaching search I've covered. The first one featured an athletic director having pretty much already made the decision 5 days after I think Bo had been fired. Mike Riley had already been announced, and that was a Sean I course basically went out and did what he was going to do. The next one was always going to be Scott Frost, assuming that he said yes. So it wasn't like a real coaching search, but we did learn, along the way that Justin Fuente was like the backup option. Then the Virginia Tech coach, who's now, I believe, an offensive coordinator somewhere in the college football landscape. So, this one starting in September is unlike anything I have experienced. And with that, you get like the ebbs and flows of like the early sort of onslaught of, oh, I think it should be this guy and I think it should be that guy on the message board. And then this sort of now period that people have convinced themselves Nebraska is going to go really cheap with it, that Nebraska is going to get told no by the top of their board. So it's just going to be Mickey Joseph by default. You know,
I love
that,
I love the interim guy.
yeah,
Part of the cycle. Oh, let's just keep this guy and he's
yeah.
recruiting, but it makes no sense to me personally.
Yeah, so I mean it's definitely been unique. And I think that Mickey Joseph has an opportunity to keep the job, but it would require a game like Saturday winning something like that. Like something to put yourself above just getting wins against Rutgers and Indiana. And if Nebraska makes a bowl game, if they were to somehow win against Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, even if you drop this Illinois game and you go 6-6, that's a possibility. But there has to be something more than just the first couple of weeks of excitement that we saw for this program to really sort of lean, I think, in Mickey Joseph's direction. Otherwise, things seem headed to likely an early December decision. It's just that we already know that Scott Frost is out and can cycle through every name 17 times between now and then.
What is the name you keep coming back to? I mean, for me, it's the guy Lance Leipold. Illinois thought they might get him. Brett Bielema became their top candidate, and Leipold goes to Kansas. And what he's done there is unbelievable. I just think what he does there can translate at Nebraska. And one Nebraska hasn't struggled with skill positions, Mike. It's been in the trenches, and
Yep.
I just think Leipold might not be the sexy name, the sexy personality, but he's just a damn good football coach.
Yeah, a lot of Nebraska fans have certainly been paying attention to what's happening at Kansas, and then the fact that he was once a recruiting assistant under Frank Solich has caught some attention as well as coaching at UNO. the school over in Omaha that no longer has a football program because hockey has become king there under Trev Alberts, who's now Nebraska's athletic director. So it's all one big circle, Jeremy. Nebraska is always a circle. Once you're in, you can never get out. It's interesting because early on, the name that I heard that the fan base just almost completely unanimously has rejected, and it's still very much, I think, in play, is Bill O'Brien. And he's got his Big Ten ties. He's obviously the offensive coordinator at Alabama. I think he had what should be classified as a successful tenure with the Houston Texans, but apparently making 4 playoff appearances in like 8 years to some people isn't particularly meaningful. I don't really understand it because the NFL is very difficult. But I think Bill O'Brien would be really interesting, but at least on the Husker 24/7 message boards, that's probably about as unpopular of a candidate as you could put out there. But I fully expect that he is involved to some degree. And this, I think Lance Leipold, you mentioned, is a name that's certainly going to be up there. Matt Campbell, we've heard a lot of early on. And then Iowa State started losing. And so that has been the part of this whole thing. How much does the 2022 record really matter? Yeah. If you like to coach coming into the year, what his team doesn't matter a lot because it's not like he's bringing that whole team with him to wherever he's going to go. So those are kind of the common names. Of course, you have the absurd Urban Meyer stuff and everything else. But for me, if we're just looking at these people, it probably going to end up if Mickey wins a game or two down the stretch, I think that's going to be really loud. And I could see where that's an appealing thing for Trev Alberts, I think he's got a pretty strong relationship with Mickey Joseph as a former teammate of his, and sort of how they've embraced each other since Mickey came back. And then I think Bill O'Brien. I mean, I think those are the 2 names as this comes closer. Those are the 2 that stand out. I mean, and who knows? Maybe there's a Dave Aranda that wants out of the Big 12. Maybe there's another high-level coach out there that wants out of his situation and looks at Nebraska as a place that he can sort of go and build up over time and make more money while doing it with tons of resources at his disposal. I just don't know that there's a real slam dunk name out there. I think whoever they end up with is going to have some level of warts attached to it, and the fan base is going to have to be at peace with that.
I find Matt Campbell an interesting candidate because I think he'd be on paper an A higher given what he's done at a historically bad program at Iowa State. And I just think with the resources, the talent, he can get to Nebraska. I think he can do well. And I think Nebraska's kind of an interesting recruiting territory, as you know, Mike, because it's not close to a big talent base, but it's got such a great history there and fan base there. But, Matt Campbell, is Nebraska good enough of a job for him to leave, or how long would he wait until he leaves? Because he's kind of been looking at Michigan, Penn State, seems like Ohio State, NFL. How good of a job is Nebraska now after 10 years in the Big Ten or whatever it is of not great football for Nebraska?
No, it hasn't been. And so that's like the thing you sort of have to square up. And growing up here, attending the university, I'm going to view it in a certain way that a lot of your listeners probably wouldn't.
Yeah.
But if you just go from just this angle and this angle alone, it is the single biggest sports entity in a population of close to 2 million people. It is supported ferociously, despite how horrible it has been over the last 5 years. Financially, with the Big Ten standing that it's in, it's equipped to be able to provide a ton of resources to whoever it hires. I mean, if they hire a coach at $6 million, it's not unreasonable that the assistant salary pool combined with coordinators and support staff and all of that could be $14 million. Like, they could spend $20 million on a coaching staff, and that money is all there and available to be used if that's how they choose to go about it. And then on top of it, and I don't know what it's like for every other Big Ten institution, but there's a new collective popping up every other day in Lincoln. And that has its own sort of differing effects where eventually you need one or two to sort of kind of run things. But the support is incredibly strong. The fan support is incredibly strong. And even though the recruiting resources, like what you have right around you to go out in the 250 miles from your campus isn't necessarily awash with 5-star talent, there's good enough players at Kansas State, Iowa State, Minnesota, Illinois. Like all of these teams have made runs in the last 5 or 6 years and have the ability to be top 25 schools. Every one of those teams that I said has been a top 25 school. Nebraska has not, and has no less ability to get the same players or to get the same results. So it's kind of a tricky job. I honestly, the biggest detractor to it is the fishbowl mentality, is the Riki desperation that sort of sits on top of the city of Lincoln and the state of Nebraska, where whoever takes this job is just going to feel that desperation in every conversation they have with a local, in every press conference, in every, community event that they, through contractual obligations, are supposed to be there to cut the red ribbon. So that desperation would be maybe the biggest deterrent. And so you have to find someone who's comfortable with that. Yeah. Scott Frost was never comfortable being the public face of his former university, which is sort of insane because he knew exactly what that was going to be. And I think he initially welcomed it, and then it didn't go well, and then he didn't want it. And it's not how that works. Mike Riley really welcomed it and then wasn't the right person for it. So there's a way to find an individual who actually sort of seeks out, like, I'm the guy, like you play into their ego a little bit. And so I think that could work out. But you've got to have a coach that is at least comfortable with the idea that he is supposed to be the biggest show in town. And with that comes extremely annoying and outsized expectations, but also a lavish and comfortable lifestyle.
It feels like Penn State. I feel like Nebraska and Penn State have a lot in common. I think their schooling can be similar. Like, Penn State, we think of East Coast. It's really insular. That's the biggest thing in that area of the state. And there's no reason I think that Nebraska can't be that. That's why the job is so intriguing, Mike, is because the ceiling of it is ridiculous, but we've seen the floor and all the negatives.
Yeah. I hope this is the floor, because I think it can still get worse some way, somehow. I think it still can.
Well, Mike, we got an actual Big Ten football game here.
True.
Let's talk about this, because it is a big game, because Nebraska, I don't know how excited you should be about a win over Indiana and Rutgers, and the Rutgers one was really ugly. But Nebraska beat Indiana. Illinois didn't beat Indiana. But both these teams separated by just one game in the Big Ten West. I think we know Illinois has been better so far this year. But how has Mickey Joseph made an impact on this program? Because I got to give them credit, despite that start to the Rutgers game, despite Indiana scoring early. This team's fighting, it seems like.
Yeah, I think in part the fact that the worst thing that could happen has already happened. Nebraska basically came in and played tight across 3 games because everybody knew if they didn't win enough, everyone knows the October 1 drop date for Scott Frost. Like, that couldn't have been discussed more in an entire offseason. And they tried to do their best to say that it didn't matter and all of these different things. But there was a certain looseness that comes to a program when what can get worse? Your defensive coordinator got fired, your head coach got fired. Like, what's left? They're going to start getting rid of the guys who, pick up after you in the locker room or, wash your jerseys. So it kind of just becomes, you got that out of the way. And then a lot of what Mickey Joseph basically said is, we're just going to try to get better at the fundamentals. When you turn on the tape of those first 3 games and throw in Oklahoma, because that one was ugly too, but you throw on that tape, they weren't tackling well. They weren't doing anything particularly well. And they have too many players that are at least quality Big Ten players for their defense to have been as bad as it was. It still has a lot of issues. It's still, a pretty good matchup if you're Illinois' offensive coordinator. on Saturday, and given Nebraska's struggles against the run. But it got better because they got better at tackling. They got better because Garrett Nelson, a player that has, all Big Ten potential for third team or second team, started making plays on the edge. It got better because Luke Reimer started playing better. So some of it was you got better performances from guys that you were expecting to play better than they did in the first 3 weeks of the year. And I think that Bill Bush, the new defensive coordinator, has simplified things. They've removed a lot of checks. They're playing a ton of base defense, which basically just for them means, all right, we're gonna try to just keep everything in front of us. They play a lot of cover 2 zone, a lot of cover 2, cover 3 zone looks. I mean, they're really not particularly exotic at this point in time. It's just a lot of like, let's just line up and try to play football on the defensive side. Offensively, they figured out that their best strategy is to get Trey Palmer the ball, and usually to get it as far away from where the play started, because that means they have less distance to cover and there's less bad things that can happen. I mean, the whole game against Purdue was basically, if this drive takes longer than 2 minutes, we're not going to score because our offensive line can't protect. Illinois' biggest challenge on Saturday is going to be, how do we make sure that they're not scheming up something to get Trey Palmer open, or do we just try to let everybody but Trey Palmer beat us? Can Nebraska win a game that way? Their wins this year, Trey Palmer's been really valuable for them. Even in that game against Purdue, where they were a double-digit, underdog, they really had a chance to win that game in the second half. They just couldn't make the right combination of plays at the right time, but they gave themselves an opportunity because Trey Palmer was just very difficult to stop. And there's no other secret to it. I mean, Anthony Grant's fine. The offensive line is terrible. Casey Thompson can throw a decent deep ball, and that's it. There's no mystery about this team.
I find this matchup fascinating, at least the wide receiver Trey Palmer and Casey Thompson against an Illinois secondary that hasn't played against a wide receiver as talented as Trey. But I mean, Devin Witherspoon's an NFL player. Quan Martin's an NFL player, but they run man to man, Mike, and they have a single high safety. Can they do that against Trey Palmer? Can they be successful? But then they're probably going to get a ton of pressure on Casey Thompson because their offensive line, as you said, Nebraska's offensive line is bad, and Illinois' defensive line is
very good.
It's very, very good. So, but I find that fascinating because I can see Nebraska getting a couple big plays and being competitive because they have a quarterback that wants to throw deep, isn't afraid to throw deep, even if he's going to throw picks. And they got a wide receiver that's probably going to be drafted pretty high.
Yeah, I really think a lot of this game comes down to, does Illinois just basically build a 10-point lead and then sit on the ball? I mean, because they have the ability to basically just keep Nebraska's offense off the field for long, long chunks. And then all that does is when they come back on the field, and Nebraska is not trying to drive the ball because they can't. They just can't. I mean, if they have to have a 4-minute drive, there's going to be a false start, a holding penalty, a strip sack, something dumb is going to happen there because they just don't have the ability to do that. If Illinois can get up by double digits in the first half and just sit on the ball, that makes it really difficult. Nebraska's whole thing is they have to basically try to blitzkrieg Illinois early, get a lead, and then figure out how they're going to hold on to the lead. Or just keep it a 1-score game the entire time, so they're always one play away. That was the Purdue strategy, always be one play away once we fell down early. So for me, it'd be fascinating. If for whatever reason Nebraska's leading in the fourth quarter, do they actually have the ability they can run time off the clock? Because I don't know that they can. If they're in a 2-minute offense against this Illinois defense, are you just going to run for -8 yards? Because that's what it's going to look like if you just try to line it up and run time off the clock. So from a variance standpoint, these strategies could not be more different. Yeah. And so I think that's what makes Saturday really fascinating, because you could draw this thing to go a bunch of different ways. Even if the result of an Illinois win still largely seems like it's going to be the same, it's how they get there. Can they just get a lead early and just keep Nebraska off the field? Or does Nebraska make them sweat all the way to the end because they just have that big play potential?
Nebraska has given up 200 rushing yards to most teams, right? Yeah. To most teams on their schedule. How do they slow down Chase Brown? Josh McCray is supposed to be back. How do they do it? You said defense has shown a little bit of improvement here. Obviously Purdue carved them up, but against
Yeah.
Rutgers, Indiana, they showed some improvement.
Yeah, the fascinating thing about Purdue was that they couldn't stop Charlie Jones and they couldn't stop Mockabee. So, I mean, Purdue could basically just decide which of the two ways it wanted to move the ball most of that game. Um, Nebraska hasn't stopped Brown the last two times they played him, right? And that was with better defensive fronts than what they're going to bring into Saturday. So to me, it basically feels like, are they going to have to try to just load up completely against the run? Do they have something exotic to do that? And then on top of it, one of their better linebackers and Nick Henrich is done for the year. So they're going to be playing, probably a little bit undersized at linebacker against a big offensive line and a team that, last year, how many times did Illinois just run that same stretch play, just letting Brown search for, a spot along the sidelines until he hit Nebraska for a 42-yard run. I mean, and they were better equipped last year to stop that Illinois offense, and they still struggled with it. So they're going to have to get exotic, or they're going to have to hope that their tackling is they're able to just get them down on first contact, because if Illinois can live in third and short all game, and I think that they will be able to, they're just going to chain together drives until they start breaking big plays. And then once they start breaking big plays is when Nebraska is really worried.
So this Nebraska fan base is known as being really nice. You know that, Mike. Are they
passive aggressive, nice, but nice nonetheless?
Is that turning at all? Like after these last 6, 7, 8, 9 years?
I don't think that it's turned towards the opponent. The funny thing about the Nebraska nice component is that Nebraska fans still very much feel like they should see victories from their team every week. And they still very much appreciate and congratulate and everything the people that come out to visit. They've just turned on themselves. They're just feeding on themselves at this point. So it's, any Illinois fans that come out this weekend, they're going to be treated to a great time. They'll be welcome at any of the tailgates. That's always going to be true. But they'll also probably get a front row seat to the straight up bickering and the dog eat dog world of Nebraska fans turning on Nebraska fans, because that's really kind of where we're at with it.
Understandable. Last one, Mike. I got to ask you, because I've been talking about this for a while. Trev Alberts brought back Scott Frost, right, to save money, I would imagine.
Yeah.
It was the big move. He didn't end up saving any money, right?
Nope.
I mean, firing people, hiring, like this didn't work out very well for Trev Alberts.
It did and it didn't, because the tinfoil hat part of me thinks that he didn't want to make that move last year because there was still probably more than 50% support for a homegrown guy in Scott Frost, even at 3-9, because Nebraska lost all of those games, as Reddit College Football was, loved to point out, was only a play away from being like 11-1.
They shouldn't have been
the greatest 3-9 team of all time.
They shouldn't have been in so many close games, Mike.
Yeah, I get it. I completely with you. I thought that Nebraska should have moved on last November, but I think in part because it was going to be more palatable if Nebraska failed again this season with the way that schedule started. That decision made sense to Trev Alberts at the time. And I've also been told, and I believe it, that, he very much wanted to try to save money on this aspect because of how much money Nebraska's pushed out the door for various coaches in the last few years and athletic directors. I mean, Nebraska's paid a lot of people a lot of money to not be very good at their job for the last 10 years. So I think he was hoping to at least mitigate some of that. And yet at the same time, I mean, they could have made that decision after the Northwestern game. You sort of knew where that season was as soon as they lost that game over in Ireland. And so I give him credit for having the willingness to just admit it and eat it after the loss to Georgia Southern, because I do think in a lot of ways it saved what could be left of Nebraska's season. I don't think they win the game against Indiana if Scott Frost is their coach. I doubt they beat Rutgers if Scott Frost is their coach. And maybe they only get to 4 wins, which would be another win this season. But at least you're giving your players an opportunity to play for something rather than being 2-8 going into the final 2 games against Wisconsin and Iowa and wondering what the hell you're doing here anyways. So I do think we're going to look back on it as the right decision. and the wrong one was made the previous November. So it's going to be about a 50-50.
Well, I always look forward to my trips to Lincoln. Not so much about the chili and cinnamon rolls. I still think,
Hey, it's 2:30. You're not going to get that.
oh, I won't. That's right. That's right. So
You'll
stay by that one.
It'll probably be some like Salisbury steak type dish or something that feels at home in a like 8th grade lunch, that kind of thing.
Perfectly Nebraska. Mike Schaefer, perfectly Nebraska as well. Thanks, man.
All right. Thanks, Jeremy.